Welcome, friends. Tonight we leave behind the buzz of electric lights, the hum of appliances, and the comfort of climate control, and return to a time when survival wasn't something you prepared for, it was simply how you lived. Imagine a world lit only by firelight, a world where the soil was both your pantry and your battleground, where the wind could steal your roof, the cold could take your breath, and yet somehow people endured. Not with gadgets or gear, but with instinct, rhythm, and quiet resilience. In the Middle Ages, survival was not a weekend project or a trend on a screen. It was in the way you layered wool at night, in the way you kept an ember burning beneath ash, in the way you traded a dozen eggs for a pair of sturdy boots or a sack of oats. There were no tutorials, no bug-out plans, just wisdom passed from weathered hands to willing hearts. Tonight, you'll hear how peasants, shepherds, and wandering monks survived everything from famine to frostbite. You'll learn how they listened to the land, leaned on one another, and crafted an unspoken system of endurance that modern minds often overlook. So settle in, let your breath slow, and let the crackle of imagined hearth fire guide you gently into a forgotten world, one where survival meant knowing the wind, trusting the soil, and waking each day with patience, not panic. This is the forgotten art of survival. Welcome to the journey. The forgotten art of survival. Before survival was a checklist, before it became a hobby for a comfortable age, it was simply the air one breathed. In the modern world, we prepare for a future that might happen. We fill basements with sealed buckets of grain and plastic jugs of water, arranging our anxieties on neat metal shelves. We practice for a theoretical collapse, a storm on a distant horizon. This is a preparation born of choice, of excess time and resource. It is a dialogue with fear, but a fear that is managed, cataloged, and contained. For the medieval mind, survival was not a project to be undertaken, but the very texture of existence. It was an inherited rhythm, a set of instincts passed down not through books or tutorials, but through the calloused hands of a mother showing a daughter which root to dig, through the quiet nod of a father teaching a son the language of the wind and the sky. There was no clear line where daily life ended and survival began. They were one and the same, an unending, seamless garment woven from threads of constant, low-grade uncertainty. Imagine a world without the illusion of control. The sky was not a backdrop for your day. It was an active participant, a fickle overlord that could bestow the gift of a gentle sun for the harvest, or unleash a torrent of hail that could shatter a year's work in a single roaring afternoon. A strange warmth in winter was not a pleasant novelty, but a deeply unsettling omen, a sign that the world's sacred clock was broken. A cough in the next dwelling was not a minor inconvenience. It was a potential herald of the unseen wind that could sweep through a village and leave half its hearths cold forever. Famine was not a news story from a faraway land. It was the ghost that sat at every table, the silent guest who grew larger and more menacing as the grain stores dwindled. Raiders were not the villains of a fantasy tale, but a tangible threat that could materialize from the mist at the edge of the woods, their arrival announced only by the frantic barking of dogs and the smell of smoke that did not come from a neighbor's chimney. This constant proximity to the edge was not a source of perpetual panicked terror. The human spirit, in its profound adaptability, does not live in a state of screaming alarm. Instead, this uncertainty was absorbed into the collective consciousness, creating a mindset of profound and watchful patience. It was a state of being that is almost impossible for the modern psyche to truly inhabit. It was a life lived in the present tense because the future was so utterly unknowable. Plans were made not in years or decades, but in seasons, in the phases of the moon, in the life cycle of a pig or a stand of wheat.
The focus was not on thriving, but on enduring. The goal was not to conquer nature, but to bend with it, to listen to its whispers and respect its power. Survival was not an act of aggressive defiance against the world, but a quiet, devotional act of partnership with it. The knowledge required for this endurance was not stored on a hard drive or printed on waterproof paper. It lived in the body, in muscle memory, in the senses. A peasant knew the feel of good soil by its crumble and its smell, a texture that told them if it would hold water or let it run away. They could tell the time of day not by a clock, but by the angle of the sun and the quality of the light, the way it filtered through the leaves of an oak tree. They knew the coming of rain not from a forecast, but from the ache in their joints, the behavior of birds, the scent of dampness rising from the earth itself. This was a literacy of the senses, a deep and intimate reading of the world that we have almost entirely forgotten. Our eyes are trained to read screens. Their eyes were trained to read the clouds. Our ears are trained to filter out the noise of the city. Their ears were trained to distinguish the snap of a dry twig under a predator's paw from the gentle settling of a forest at dusk. This was not a romantic existence. It was a life of profound hardship, of aching backs and weary limbs, of hunger that was a dull, constant companion. But within that hardship was a deep-seated resilience, a strength that came not from individual force of will, but from a shared understanding of reality. Survival was a communal verb. It was the unspoken agreement to share the last of the embers from your fire with a neighbor whose hearth had gone cold. It was the collective wisdom of the village, a library of lived experience where every elder was a volume of priceless information. It was the understanding that your own survival was inextricably linked to the survival of the person in the hut next to you, to the health of the communal well, to the strength of the simple wattle fence that kept the wolves from the sheep. Prepping today is often a solitary pursuit, a fortification of the self against the world. Medieval survival was the opposite. It was the weaving of the self into the fabric of a community and a landscape, the understanding that a single thread alone is fragile, but together the threads could form a cloth strong enough to withstand the storm. This was the forgotten art, not just how to survive, but how to exist within a world that demanded your constant, humble, and unwavering attention.
Seasons as teacher. Life was not measured in hours or days, but in the slow, grand, and unforgiving turning of the seasons. There was no digital calendar to consult, no neatly printed schedule to follow. The only calendar that mattered was etched into the land itself, written in the language of light, temperature, and soil. Each season was a different teacher, offering a different set of lessons, demanding a different kind of labor, and promising a different form of survival. To ignore the teacher was to fail the test, and the cost of failure was absolute. The rhythm of life was not a choice. It was a fundamental law, as inescapable as gravity. It began with the slow, tentative awakening of the world, a deep breath taken after a long, cold sleep. Spring was not a gentle season of blossoms and birdsong alone. It was a season of profound anxiety and back-breaking work. It began with the mud. As the frost receded, the ground would turn to a thick, cold slurry that clung to boots and tools, making every step a struggle. This was the time for plowing, for turning over the heavy, sleeping earth. The work was done behind the broad, patient back of an ox, or, for the less fortunate, with the strength of human shoulders alone. The air still held a sharp, wintry bite, and the newly exposed soil smelled of damp stone and deep, cold life. This was the season of hope, but it was a hope tempered with fear. Seeds were a family's treasure, the culmination of last year's harvest and the promise of the next. To cast them upon the soil was an act of faith,
A late frost could kill the tender shoots. A week of heavy rain could wash the seeds away. A dry spell could leave them dormant and useless in the ground. Every villager watched the sky, read the wind, and felt the earth, searching for the right moment, the perfect confluence of signs that the time was right. Spring was a gamble, a prayer whispered into the furrows of the earth. Then came summer, a season not of leisure, but of relentless growth and labor. The sun, once a welcome stranger, became a demanding taskmaster. It rose early and set late, stretching the workday to its absolute limit. The world was a vibrant, almost aggressive green. The crops in the fields grew with a visible urgency, and with them, the weeds. Summer was a constant battle against the encroaching wilderness, a war waged with scythes and hoes under a blazing, indifferent sky. The heat could be suffocating, the air thick with the buzzing of insects and the sweet, heavy scent of hay and wildflowers. The work was endless, weeding the vegetable patch, tending the livestock, scything the hayfields for winter fodder. Every muscle ached, every brow was beaded with sweat. But there was a deep satisfaction in it too. The sight of the wheat turning from green to gold, the sound of the bees in the clover, the feeling of the sun on your back, it was all evidence that the spring gamble was paying off. Summer was the season of maintenance, of tending the sacred promise made to the earth months before. It was a long, slow exhalation of effort. Autumn arrived not as a gentle transition, but as a frantic, urgent race against the dying of the light. The harvest was the single most important event of the year, the moment when an entire community's survival was weighed and measured. The days grew shorter, the air crisper. The first chill of morning was a stark reminder that winter was waiting in the wings. There was no time to lose. Everyone, from the youngest child capable of gathering fallen grain to the oldest elder who could mend a basket, was put to work in the fields. The rhythmic swish of the scythe, the bundling of sheaves, the heavy thud of grain being threshed, these were the sounds of autumn. The smells were of dust, dry stalks, and the rich, nutty aroma of harvested wheat. It was a time of immense physical exertion, but also of communal celebration. If the harvest was good, there was a palpable sense of relief, a collective sigh that rippled through the village. The grain was brought to the storehouse, the last of the root vegetables were dug from the cooling earth, and the world began to prepare for the great sleep. Autumn was the season of judgment, the final accounting of the year's labor. And then winter. Winter was the season of stillness and shadow. The world outside the hut became a hostile place, ruled by biting wind, deep snow, and a profound, enduring cold. Life contracted, folding inward like a flower closing at dusk. The focus shifted from the fields to the hearth. The days were short and dark, the nights immensely long. Survival in winter was a passive art. It was about conservation, of warmth, of food, of energy. The work was quieter, more domestic, mending tools, spinning wool, carving wood, telling stories by the fire. It was a time of hunger for many, a slow, draining test of the autumn's preparations. The silence of a snow-covered landscape could be both beautiful and menacing. Every creak of the hut's timbers, every howl of the wind, was a reminder of the fragility of the shelter that stood between the family and the deadly cold. Winter was the great teacher of patience and humility. It taught that survival was not always about doing, but sometimes about simply being, about enduring the darkness and trusting with a deep and ancient faith that the sun would, eventually, return. The forager's eye.
Survival did not always come from the neatly plowed field or the fenced-in pasture. Often, it began at ground level, in the wild, untamed spaces that lay between the village and the deep woods. It began with the forager's eye, a different kind of seeing, a literacy that read the language of leaves, stems, and roots. To the modern eye, a meadow is a uniform wash of green. To the medieval forager, it was a living pantry, a complex tapestry of nourishment, medicine, and danger. This knowledge was not learned from a book, it was absorbed through a lifetime of observation, passed down from a grandmother's hand to a child's, a quiet inheritance of priceless worth. It was a skill that required all the senses, a deep and intimate conversation with the earth itself. The forager's eye did not just see a plant, it saw its story. It saw the slight curl of a leaf that indicated a certain time of year, the specific shade of green that spoke of good soil, the way a stem bent that hinted at the strength of the root beneath. It was an eye for pattern and for anomaly. It knew that wild garlic often grew in damp, shady groves, its scent a welcome announcement long before its bright green shoots were visible. It knew that the cheerful yellow heads of dandelions, a nuisance to the modern lawn keeper, were a treasure. The young leaves, though bitter, were one of the first fresh greens of spring, a welcome relief after a winter of dried and salted foods. The root, when dried and roasted, could be a passable substitute for a warm drink. The forager saw not a weed, but a cycle of utility. The hands were as important as the eyes. Knowledge was tactile. The forager knew the telltale sting of the nettle, but also knew that this formidable plant was a powerhouse of survival. When boiled, its sting vanished, leaving behind a dark, iron-rich green that could be made into a nourishing soup or pottage. Its tough, fibrous stems could be processed with much labor into a thread stronger and finer than most wool. To handle a nettle was to understand its dual nature, its ability to both harm and heal. The hands could feel the difference between the smooth, waxy leaf of a poisonous plant and the slightly fuzzy texture of an edible one. They learned the precise pressure needed to pull a burdock root from the stubborn earth, a long, deep taproot that once cleaned and cooked provided a starchy, earthy sustenance through the leanest months. The sense of smell was a constant guide and guardian. Before a single berry was tasted, it might be crushed between the fingers, its scent a vital clue. The sharp, clean smell of wild mint, the oniony tang of ramps, the sweet perfume of elderflowers, these were signatures of safety and value. Conversely, a strange, acrid, or unpleasant smell was a clear warning, a sign to leave a plant untouched. The nose could detect the subtle aroma of mushrooms rising from the damp forest floor, a scent of earth, decay, and life. But mushroom foraging was the domain of the most experienced, a high-stakes game, where the difference between a delicious meal and a painful death could be as subtle as the color of its gills or the shape of its cap. This was knowledge held with a kind of reverence, a wisdom that was never taken for granted. This intimate relationship with the wild larder was a continuous, year-round activity. In the spring, it was about a search for tender greens and shoots. In the summer, the prize was wild berries, sweet wild strawberries, tart raspberries, and later the deep purple-black of blackberries, their thorns a small price to pay for such a burst of sweetness. These were eaten fresh, a rare and joyful treat, or painstakingly collected to be dried or preserved for the winter. Autumn was the time for nuts, hazelnuts, walnuts, and acorns, which required a long process of leaching to remove their bitterness but could be ground into a coarse flour to supplement the grain stores. It was also the season for digging roots,
the Earth's hidden stores of energy, now at their peak before the winter frost. The forager's eye was a quiet rebellion against the ever-present threat of starvation. When the crops failed, when the grain ran low, it was this knowledge that stood between a family and true despair. It was the understanding that the forest, the meadow, and the hedgerow were not empty spaces, but extensions of the pantry, offering their gifts to those who knew how to ask, how to see, and how to listen. It was a skill that fostered a deep and abiding respect for the land, a recognition of its immense generosity and its unforgiving rules. The world was not just a place to be lived upon, but a text to be read, and the forager was its most fluent and devoted reader.
Preservation without power. In a world without refrigeration, without canning jars or vacuum sealers, the harvest was not an end, but a beginning. It was the start of a frantic, essential process, the race to preserve the bounty of the fat months against the encroaching scarcity of the lean. Survival depended not on how much you could grow, but on how much you could keep. The methods were ancient, elemental, and relied on the fundamental forces of nature: salt, smoke, sun, and air. This was not a science of precise measurements and sterile equipment. It was an art form born of instinct, of sensory feedback, and of knowledge passed down through generations. It was a tactile, physical dialogue with the food itself, a process of transformation that turned the perishable into the enduring. Salt was the first and most powerful ally. It was a precious commodity, sometimes as valuable as currency, and its primary role was as a preserver of meat. After an animal was slaughtered, a rare and significant event, the meat was quickly and thoroughly processed. Every part was used, but the large cuts of pork or beef were destined for the salt barrel. The process was direct and physical. Coarse, heavy salt crystals were rubbed deep into the flesh, a vigorous massage that forced the salt into every fiber. The meat was then layered in a wooden barrel with more salt, packed down tightly to remove any air pockets. The salt worked its slow magic, drawing out the moisture that bacteria needed to thrive, effectively desiccating the meat from the inside out. The air in the larder would grow thick with the sharp, clean, mineral smell of curing. After weeks or months, the meat would be transformed into a hard, dense, intensely salty substance, ham, bacon, or salt beef, that could last for a year or more, a solid reserve of protein waiting to be sliced thin and boiled to release some of its saltiness. Smoke was the second great transformer, a method that preserved while also imparting a deep, complex flavor. A small, often windowless hut would serve as the smokehouse. Inside, strips of meat or whole fish would be hung from the rafters, suspended in a cool, smoky gloom. On the floor below, a fire of hard wood, often oak or hickory, would be kept smoldering, but never flaming. It was a low, slow, patient process. The smoke would rise in a thick, lazy cloud, bathing the hanging food for days or even weeks. The chemical compounds in the wood smoke acted as antimicrobial agents, while the constant circulation of dry air further dehydrated the surface. The food would slowly change color, turning a deep, burnished gold, then a rich, dark mahogany. The smell was intoxicating, acrid, sweet, and deeply savory. Smoked fish and meats were not just preserved, they were elevated, turned into something profoundly flavorful that could be eaten in small, satisfying amounts throughout the winter. The sun and the wind were free and powerful tools for preservation, used for fruits, vegetables, and herbs. On clear, dry, breezy days, the harvest would be laid out on clean cloths, wooden racks, or even the thatched roof of a hut. Sliced apples, plums, and wild berries would slowly shrivel under the sun's steady warmth, their sugars concentrating, their forms shrinking into small, leathery, long-lasting morsels of sweetness. Herbs gathered from the garden or the wild Thyme, rosemary, sage were tied into bundles and hung from the rafters inside the home, away from direct sunlight, where the dry, circulating air would slowly draw out their moisture, preserving their essential oils and flavors for use in winter stews. Mushrooms, forged from the forest floor, were threaded onto long strings and hung near the hearth, where the gentle, radiant heat would turn them into light, brittle chips that could be rehydrated months later. Fermentation was another form of controlled transformation, a way of using beneficial microorganisms to ward off the harmful ones. Cabbages were shredded, salted, and packed tightly into large earthenware crocks. The salt would draw out the cabbage's water, creating its own brine, and over time, the natural yeasts and bacteria on the leaves would begin to work their magic, converting sugars into lactic acid. This acidic environment pickled the cabbage, preserving it as sauerkraut, a tangy, nutrient-rich food that provided vital vitamins in the dead of winter. In a similar way, milk could be turned into cheese, a process that converted a highly perishable liquid into a solid, stable block of concentrated fat and protein that could be stored for months. Cucumbers, beets, and other vegetables could be submerged in a brine of salt and water, or a sharp vinegar, to be kept in crocks in a cool, dark cellar. This was preservation as a living process, a partnership with invisible forces to create longevity. Every bubble in the fermenting crock, every change in color of the smoking meat, every new texture in the sun-drying fruit was a sign of success, another small victory in the quiet, constant war against decay.
The humble pantry. The heart of a medieval home was the hearth, but its soul, its promise of a future, was the pantry. This was not the bright, organized, walk-in space of modern imagination. More often it was a small, cool, windowless room, a deep cupboard, or a shallow earth-dug cellar. It was a place of shadows and quiet, its air thick with a complex perfume of survival, the sharp tang of vinegar, the smoky scent of cured meat, the earthy smell of root vegetables, and the dusty fragrance of dried herbs. This humble space, often no larger than a closet, was the physical manifestation of a family's foresight and labor. It held the difference between enduring the winter and succumbing to it. To step inside was to step into a library of preserved time, where the work of summer and autumn sat silently, waiting. The shelves, if they existed, were rough-hewn planks of wood, holding a collection of earthenware crocks and clay pots. Within these vessels, the alchemy of preservation was complete. One large crock might hold sauerkraut, its surface weighted down with a flat stone to keep the cabbage submerged in its own tangy brine. Opening it would release a sharp, pungent but clean aroma, the smell of life preserved through fermentation. Another pot might contain pickled eggs, floating like pale moons in a bath of vinegar and spices. These were a precious source of protein, their sharp taste a welcome jolt to a palate dulled by a diet of bland grains. Smaller jars could hold jams and preserves made from wild berries, sweetened with honey if the family was fortunate, their jewel-like colors a distant memory of summer's warmth. From the low wooden rafters above, treasures would hang in the cool, still air. A string of dried mushrooms, light and brittle, would rustle softly in a stray draft. Bundles of dried herbs, thyme, sage, and rosemary, would hang upside down, their faint, dusty scent perfuming the space. They were the ghosts of the summer garden, waiting to lend their phantom flavors to the winter pottage. Beside them, there might be a string of dark, wrinkled apples, dehydrated to a leathery toughness, their sweetness concentrated into a long-lasting treat. Perhaps most prized of all would be the smoked and salted meats, a side of bacon, its surface dark and hard from the smokehouse, a string of smoked fish, their silver skins now a burnished gold, a cured ham encased in a crust of salt and spices, heavy and dense as a stone. Each of these was a monument to a season of plenty,
a promise of savory, life-sustaining fat and protein during the cold months. On the cool, earthen floor, other forms of storage were practiced. In one corner, a wooden bin or a simple pile of sand would hold the root vegetables. Carrots, turnips, and parsnips, buried in the sand, would remain crisp and fresh for months, protected from both frost and rot. The sand wicked away excess moisture while insulating the roots from the cold, a simple but ingenious method of extending their life. Nearby, a sack made of coarse burlap might be filled with dried beans, peas, or lentils. Running a hand through them would produce a dry, rattling sound, the sound of stored energy. These legumes were the backbone of the winter diet, a reliable source of sustenance that could be soaked and boiled into a thick, hearty soup or stew. Onions and garlic, their papery skins dry and rustling, would be plaited into long ropes and hung from a peg on the wall, their pungent life force held in suspension. The pantry was a place of quiet accounting. The keeper of the home would know its contents intimately, not by a written list, but by sight, touch, and memory. They knew the weight of the remaining grain sack, the number of smoked fish left hanging, the level of the sauerkraut in the crock. This knowledge dictated the daily meal, the rationing of precious resources. Taking something from the pantry was always a conscious act, a withdrawal from a shared account of survival. It was a space that bred a deep respect for food, a profound understanding of its value. Nothing was wasted. Every salted fish, every pickled turnip, every dried bean was a testament to the hard work that had brought it there and a vital component of the family's continued existence. In its cool, fragrant darkness, the humble pantry did not just hold food, it held the quiet, steady heartbeat of the home through the long, silent winter.
Warmth without wood stoves. In the modern world, warmth is a commodity. We purchase it with the turn of a dial, a flip of a switch. It arrives silently, invisibly, filling our well-insulated homes with an even, predictable comfort. For the medieval household, warmth was not a commodity. It was a creature. It had to be captured, nurtured, and jealously guarded. It was a precious and fleeting thing. Constantly trying to escape through the porous walls of the home, always threatened by the vast, indifferent cold that lay just outside. The struggle for warmth was a central, daily drama of survival, a battle fought not with technology, but with simple materials, shared bodies, and an intimate understanding of heat's fundamental nature. Comfort was not a given. It was earned, moment by slow moment. The primary source of heat, the sun of the domestic universe, was the central hearth. But this was not the roaring, inefficient fireplace of a grand castle. In a peasant's hut, the fire was kept deliberately small and low-burning to conserve precious firewood. It was a source of heat, but its reach was limited. The space directly in front of the hearth was a small island of comfort in an ocean of chill. The rest of the single-room dwelling remained steeped in a damp, penetrating cold. The very architecture of the home was a testament to this reality. Walls of wattle and daub, a lattice of woven twigs packed with mud, straw, and clay were poor insulators. Roofs of thick thatch provided some barrier, but the cold was a persistent intruder, seeping through every crack and crevice. Therefore, survival depended on preserving and sharing what little warmth was generated. The first layer of defense was clothing, a topic for another time, but the second was the strategic use of bodies. Human beings are small furnaces, constantly generating heat. In the medieval home, this simple biological fact was a cornerstone of winter survival. Families lived, worked, and slept in close proximity, not just for social reasons, but for thermal ones. In the evening, the family would gather close to the hearth, their bodies forming a collective barrier against the cold, sharing their radiant heat. The air within this small human circle would be noticeably warmer than the air just a few feet away. This principle of shared warmth reached its zenith at bedtime. Sleep was a communal affair. The entire family, and sometimes even a guest or a farmhand, would often share a single large bed. This was typically a simple frame stuffed with a mattress of straw, chaff, or, for the more fortunate, feathers. Piling into this bed was a practical necessity. Bodies pressed together, sharing their warmth under a mound of heavy woolen blankets and animal pelts, created a microclimate of relative comfort. The straw mattress itself provided a crucial layer of insulation from the cold, damp floor. To sleep alone in such a world was to risk a deep, life-sapping chill that could settle into the bones and invite illness. The shared bed was a small, warm raft in the cold, dark sea of the night. Animals, too, were partners in the quest for warmth. In many simpler dwellings, a partition of wood or wattle was all that separated the human living space from the area where livestock were sheltered for the night. The family's cow, goat, or a few sheep, brought inside to protect them from predators in the worst of the weather, contributed their significant body heat to the home. The air would be thick with the earthy animal smell, but this was a small price to pay for the ambient warmth they generated. Their slow, rhythmic breathing, the soft rustle of their bedding, was part of the domestic soundscape, a living, breathing reminder of the interconnectedness of all life within the household. Every action was considered through the lens of heat conservation. A heavy curtain of wool or thick hide would be hung over the doorway, the home's largest opening, to block drafts. Windows, if they existed at all, were small unglazed openings that would be stuffed with straw, oiled cloth, or covered with wooden shutters at night. The very act of cooking over the hearth served a dual purpose, simultaneously preparing food and infusing the central part of the home with precious heat and steam. Warmth was not squandered. It was hoarded, shared, and recycled. It was found in the proximity of a neighbor, the body of a cow, the shared breath of a sleeping family. It was a fragile, hard-won victory, achieved not through power, but through a deep and practical understanding of humility and interdependence.
Embers never die. The day does not end when the sun falls below the horizon. It ends when the fire is put to bed. Throughout the waking hours, the hearth is the gravitational center of the home, a small, domestic sun around which all life orbits. It is where the morning's gruel is warmed, where the damp wool of a tunic is dried, where stories are told in the flickering gloam, and where the faces of the family are illuminated in soft, dancing light. The fire is more than a tool. It is a presence, a living member of the household. It has a voice, a soft crackle, a low hiss, a sudden sharp pop. It has a breath, a pulse of warmth that pushes back the ever-present cold that seeps through the wattle and daub walls. And like any living thing, it must be tended to with care, especially at the close of the day. To let the fire die completely is not just an inconvenience, it is a small death, a severing of continuity, a failure of stewardship. And so, as the last of the evening's meager meal is finished, and the household prepares for the long, dark hours of sleep, a quiet and ancient ritual begins. It is a process known as banking the fire, or covering the coals. This is not a task performed with haste. It is a slow, deliberate dance of preservation. First, the remaining logs, now glowing with deep internal heat, are gently pushed to the center of the hearth. The flames have long since subsided, leaving behind the most precious resource of all, the embers. These are the seeds of the next day's warmth, the sleeping heart of the fire. With a simple wooden paddle or a flat stone, the keeper of the hearth, often the mother or an elder, gathers the finest of them. They are the ones that glow with the most intense, patient red, a color like a drowsy sunset. These chosen embers are nestled together, a small, breathing mound of concentrated life. Then comes the ash. The hearth is full of it,
the gray silken remnants of days and weeks of burning. The ash is the fire's blanket. It is an insulator, a protective shroud that will starve the embers of just enough air to keep them from burning out, but not so much that they grow cold and die. A thick, generous layer of this cool, soft ash is carefully scooped over the glowing mound. It is patted down gently, sealing the warmth within. To an outsider, the hearth would now look dead, a cold pit of gray dust. There is no light, no smoke, no sign of the fiery life that is sleeping just beneath the surface. The fire has been tucked in for the night, its breath slowed to a near imperceptible rhythm, its energy conserved for the morning to come. This silent, humble act was one of the most fundamental skills of medieval survival, a technique so common it was performed without thought, yet so vital it meant the difference between a warm start to a day of hard labor and a frustrating, cold, and time-consuming struggle. To create fire from nothing was an arduous task. It required a piece of flint, a shard of iron pyrite or steel, and a small pouch of dry tinder, charcloth, fungus, or fine, fluffy plant down. In the damp, dark chill of a pre-dawn hut, striking a spark, catching it on the tinder, and coaxing it into a flame could be a desperate knuckle-scraping affair. It consumed time, energy, and precious resources. But to awaken the banked embers was an act of gentle resurrection. In the morning, while the air is still thick with the cold of the night, the ritual is performed in reverse. The blanket of ash is carefully brushed away, revealing the hidden treasure beneath. At first, the embers may look dull, their red glow faded to a faint, almost invisible pulse. But they are alive. A breath is the first offering. Leaning low, the firekeeper blows a long, slow, steady stream of air onto the coals. It is a sacred and intimate moment, a direct transfer of life from human to hearth. The first breath may seem to do nothing, but the second or third will cause a magical transformation. A tiny spot on one of the embers will begin to glow a little brighter, a pinprick of orange in the gray. More breath is offered, and the glow spreads, waking its neighbors. Soon the entire mound is breathing again, pulsing with a soft, radiant heat. Now the finest kindling is brought forth, a handful of dried moss, a twist of straw, the thinnest, most delicate slivers of wood. They are laid carefully upon the waking coals, a nest for the flame to be borne into. There is a moment of quiet anticipation. A wisp of smoke rises, then another, and then with a soft, satisfying whoosh, the first tiny yellow flame flickers into existence, fragile and yet triumphant. The heart of the home is beating once more. This nightly ritual was more than a practical chore. It was a thread of continuity, a promise made each night and fulfilled each morning. It connected one day to the next in an unbroken chain of warmth. The embers banked tonight were born of the fire from yesterday, which was born of the day before that, stretching back through generations. In a world of profound uncertainty, where life could be extinguished so easily by disease, hunger, or violence, the quiet, stubborn persistence of the embers was a powerful symbol of endurance. They were a testament to the belief that even when things appear cold and lifeless on the surface, a core of warmth and hope can be preserved through care and patience, ready to be kindled again with the coming of the light. The embers, sleeping soundly under their blanket of ash, never truly die. They wait.
Wool and willpower. Clothing in the medieval world was not a statement of fashion or personality, but a primary tool of survival. It was the first and most intimate layer of shelter, a personal barrier against a world that was often damp, cold, and abrasive. The modern wardrobe, with its vast array of specialized, lightweight, synthetic fabrics, would be an unimaginable luxury. For most people, the wardrobe was a small, simple collection of garments made from a few humble, natural materials, chief among them, wool. The story of medieval clothing is the story of wool, of linen, and of the immense human effort required to transform a plant or a fleece into a protective second skin. It is a story of function over form, of durability over decoration, of willpower woven into every thread. Wool was the undisputed king of fabrics. A sheep's fleece was a gift of incredible versatility. Its fibers have a natural crimp that traps air, creating pockets of insulation that keep the body warm even when the fabric is damp. This was a crucial property in the perpetually damp climate of much of Europe. Wool is also naturally water-resistant. Its fibers coated in a waxy substance called lanolin that helps shed light rain. It is durable, fire-resistant, and can absorb a significant amount of moisture before it feels wet to the touch. But this miracle fiber did not come ready to wear. The process was long and laborious. After the sheep were shorn, the fleece had to be cleaned of dirt, grease, and vegetable matter. Then it was carded or combed, a process of aligning the fibers with wired, toothed paddles to prepare them for spinning. Spinning was a constant, near-universal female chore. Using a simple drop spindle or a later spinning wheel, women would spend countless hours drawing out the wool fibers and twisting them into yarn. It was a task that could be done while walking, while watching children, or while sitting by the fire in the evening. The rhythmic, repetitive motion of spinning was the quiet background hum of domestic life. Once the yarn was spun, it was woven into cloth on a wooden loom, another essential household equipment. The result was a coarse, sturdy fabric known as homespun. It was often undyed, the color of the sheep it came from, creamy white, gray, brown, or black. This fabric was the foundation of the medieval wardrobe. The basic garment for both men and women was the tunic. For a peasant, this would be a simple T-shaped garment, seamed at the sides with long sleeves and a hole for the head. It might reach to the knees or the ankles, depending on the wearer's gender and occupation. Underneath the woolen tunic, a person would wear a shirt or chemise made of linen. Linen, derived from the fibrous flax plant, was another labor-intensive textile. It was smoother and softer against the skin than wool and was more absorbent, wicking sweat away from the body. It was the layer that could be more easily washed. A person might own several linen undergarments, but only one or two precious woolen outer tunics. For the legs, men wore brays, loose linen trousers, and hose, which were separate woolen leggings tied to a belt at the waist. Clothing was built to last for years, even decades. A single tunic was a significant investment of time and resources. When it became worn, it was not discarded. Holes were meticulously patched with scraps of other cloth, seams were resewn. A garment would often bear the history of its long life in a patchwork of repairs, each patch a story of thrift and necessity. When a piece of clothing was truly beyond repair, it was not thrown away. It was cut into smaller pieces to be used for patching other garments, or salvaged for its fibers, which could be shredded and respun into new, lower-quality yarn. Nothing was wasted. In the winter, layers were the key to warmth. A person might wear two tunics, a heavy woolen cloak pinned at the shoulder, and a hood or cap to prevent heat loss from the head. Shoes were simple affairs, often made of a single piece of leather sewn into a basic shape. For extra insulation against the cold, damp ground, they would be stuffed with straw or moss. The feeling of medieval clothing was one of weight and substance. A damp woolen cloak was a heavy burden to carry. The fabric was often scratchy and coarse against the skin, but it was also a profound comfort, a solid, dependable shield against the elements. To pull on a woolen tunic and a heavy cloak was to arm oneself for the daily battle against the cold. It was a survival system born not of technology, but of the patient transformation of the sheep's fleece into a durable, life-sustaining garment,
testament to the power of wool and human willpower.
Clean enough to continue. In an age obsessed with sanitization, where antimicrobial gels and sterile wipes are ubiquitous, the medieval concept of cleanliness can seem alien, even repellent. But to view it through a modern lens is to miss the point. Cleanliness in the Middle Ages was not about achieving a sterile, germ-free state. The very concept of germs was centuries away. Instead, it was a practical, functional, and often ritualized affair. It was about being clean enough to feel human, clean enough to prevent the worst of the sores and rashes that came from constant filth, clean enough to continue with the hard work of daily life. It was a system of hygiene based on the available resources: cold water, abrasive sand, fragrant herbs, and a deep, intuitive understanding of the body. The daily routine of washing was a simple, minimalist act. Upon waking, a person would likely use a basin of cold water, fetched from the nearest well or stream, to splash their face and hands. There was no hot water on tap. Heating water required a significant amount of precious firewood and time, a luxury reserved for the very wealthy or for special occasions. Soap, too, was not the scented, mass-produced bar we know today. A basic, harsh soap could be made from animal fat and wood ash lye, but it was often a caustic, unpleasant substance, used more for laundering textiles than for washing the body. For most people, the morning wash was a brisk, functional rinse with cold water, a way to wake the senses and wash away the sleep from one's eyes. Full body bathing was a much less frequent event. The image of the unwashed medieval peasant is a persistent caricature, but it is not entirely accurate. People did bathe, but the method and frequency were dictated by season and circumstance. In the summer, the local river or stream was the community bathtub. Bathing could be a social, communal activity, a chance to cool off and scrub away the grime of agricultural labor. People would use handfuls of sand or fine gravel from the riverbed as an abrasive scrub, sloughing off dirt and dead skin. Fragrant herbs like mint or meadowsweet might be crushed and rubbed on the skin, not for any antiseptic property, but for the pleasant, clean scent they imparted, a simple way to feel refreshed. In the winter, bathing was a far more challenging proposition. Submerging oneself in an icy river was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Public bathhouses existed in many towns and cities, offering the luxury of hot water in large communal tubs. But for the rural peasant, this was not an option. A winter bath at home would involve a small wooden tub placed near the hearth, filled with laboriously heated water. The entire family might use the same bathwater, one after another, starting with the most important member of the household. This was a rare event, perhaps undertaken only a few times throughout the entire cold season. More common was a dry or sweat bath, where a person would sit close to the fire, allowing the heat to induce a deep sweat, which was then wiped away with a rough linen cloth. This was a way of cleaning the pores and feeling refreshed without the immense effort of a full water bath. Hair was washed with similar infrequency. Lye-based soaps were too harsh for the hair and scalp, so people used other methods. A rinse with a diluted vinegar or ale was thought to cut through grease and leave the hair shiny. Herbal infusions made by steeping rosemary or chamomile in hot water were also used as a final rinse to give the hair a pleasant scent and a softer texture. Between washings, regular combing with a fine-toothed comb made of wood, bone, or horn was essential for removing dirt, debris, and, most importantly, lice and other parasites, which were a constant nuisance. The medieval understanding of hygiene was deeply connected to a sense of order and well-being. While they did not know about bacteria, they intuitively understood that filth,
led to sickness. They knew that a clean-swept floor, a well-aired bedding straw, and a body free from the worst of its grime contributed to a better, healthier life. Cleanliness was not an abstract ideal of purity. It was a practical tool of survival. It was about managing the constant accumulation of dirt, sweat, and soil that was an inescapable part of a life lived in close contact with the earth. It was about doing just enough to keep the body functional, to keep the spirit from being weighed down by the sheer physicality of existence, to be clean enough to face another day.
The village healer's hands. Long before the gleaming white walls of a modern hospital, before the precision of a surgeon's scalpel or the certainty of a laboratory test, there was the village healer. This figure, often a woman, was the keeper of an ancient and vital knowledge, a wisdom that existed at the crossroads of practicality, tradition, and faith. She was not a doctor in the modern sense. She was an herbalist, a midwife, a bone setter, and a counselor. Her clinic, the forest floor, and her pharmacy, the garden behind her small hut. Her authority came not from a degree, but from a lifetime of observation, from knowledge passed down through her mother's line, and from the trust of the community she served. Her hands, often stained with the juices of plants and the soil of the earth, were the first and often only hope for the sick and the injured. The healer's work began with a deep, intimate knowledge of the plant world, a wisdom that mirrored the forager's but was focused on the body's internal and external landscapes. She knew the secret properties of the common and the obscure. She knew that the downy leaves of the mullein plant could be steeped to make a tea to soothe a deep, rattling cough. She understood that the willow tree's bark contained a substance that could ease a fever and dull an aching head. She gathered yarrow, the soldier's woundwort, to pack into cuts, to stanch bleeding and prevent putrefaction. Her basket would be filled with a pharmacopoeia of nature, chamomile flowers to calm the nerves and aid sleep, peppermint for a troubled stomach, and the bright orange petals of calendula to make a salve that soothed burns and skin irritations. Her methods of preparation were simple and elemental. Poultices were a common tool. Fresh leaves or roots would be crushed or chewed into a wet pulp and applied directly to a wound, a swollen joint, or an infected sore. The plant matter would be held in place with a strip of clean linen or a large leaf, its medicinal properties slowly seeping into the skin. Tinctures were made by steeping powerful herbs in wine or ale, creating a potent liquid that could be administered in small doses. Salves and ointments were created by infusing herbs into animal fat or beeswax over a low heat, a slow process that captured their healing essence in a stable, spreadable form. The air in her small dwelling would be thick with the complex, layered scents of drying herbs, simmering infusions, and melting wax. The healer was also the village midwife, a role of immense responsibility and reverence. She would guide a laboring mother through the terrifying and beautiful ordeal of childbirth, using her knowledge of positioning, massage, and calming herbs to ease the process. She knew how to turn a breech baby, how to handle the tangled cord, and how to deliver the afterbirth safely. Her presence was a source of profound comfort and authority in a moment when a woman's life hung in the balance. She would be the first to hold the newborn, to clean it, and to check it for signs of health, her experienced hands assessing the baby's cry, its color, and its strength. But her work was not purely physical. The line between the body and the spirit, between science and magic, was porous and indistinct. A healing remedy was often accompanied by a prayer, a charm, or a ritual. An incantation might be whispered over a wound as it was being dressed. A certain herb might need to be gathered at a specific phase of the moon to be at its most potent.
This was not seen as superstition, but as a holistic understanding of healing. Sickness was not just a physical imbalance, it could be a spiritual one as well. The healer treated the whole person, tending to their fears and anxieties as carefully as she tended to their physical ailments. Her calm voice and confident touch were as much a part of the cure as the herbs she administered. The village healer walked a fine line. Her knowledge was powerful, and in a world steeped in suspicion, power could be misunderstood for something more sinister. But for the most part, she was a deeply respected and essential member of the community. She was the keeper of life, the tender of wounds, the guardian of the threshold between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Her hands, though humble, held the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of watching, listening, and learning from the earth and the human body. They offered a touch of hope in a world where pain and illness were constant, unwelcome companions.
Surviving the bite and blade. In a life defined by physical labor and rudimentary tools, injury was not a remote possibility, it was an everyday certainty. The world was full of sharp edges, hot surfaces, and uneven ground. A slip of an axe while chopping wood, a fall from a rickety ladder, a deep gash from a scythe in the hayfield, a severe burn from a sputtering cooking pot. These were common occurrences. And beyond the dangers of human tools were the dangers of the natural world. The bite of a dog, the goring from a spooked farm animal, the festering wound from a simple thorn. In an era without antibiotics, emergency rooms, or an understanding of germ theory, even a minor injury could quickly spiral into a life-threatening crisis. Survival depended on a mixture of stoic resilience, practical first aid, and a large measure of luck. When a wound occurred, the first and critical step was to stop the bleeding. This was done through the simple, intuitive method of direct pressure. A clean strip of linen, if available, or even a handful of moss or a broad leaf would be pressed firmly against the cut. For more severe bleeding, a tourniquet, a strip of cloth twisted tight with a stick, might be used on a limb, though this was a desperate measure, as it carried the risk of losing the limb entirely. Sometimes nature itself offered a solution. The fine powder of a puffball mushroom or the sticky web of a spider could be applied to a cut to help coagulate the blood, a folk remedy based on generations of trial and error. Cleaning the wound was the next crucial challenge. Without antiseptic solutions, people relied on what was available. The wound would be washed with the cleanest water that could be found, often cold water from a stream or well. Sometimes wine or vinegar would be used to flush the wound, their acidic properties having a mild cleansing effect. The village healer might use a strong herbal infusion, such as one made from yarrow or calendula, to wash the injury, believing the plants had properties that would prevent putrefaction. The goal was to remove as much visible dirt and debris as possible, a physical cleansing that was the best defense against the invisible threat of infection. Once cleaned, the wound was dressed. A healing salve, often made from herbs infused in fat or beeswax, would be applied. This served not only to deliver the medicinal properties of the herbs, but also to create a barrier, protecting the raw flesh from the air and from dirt. The wound would then be bound with strips of clean linen. These bandages were a precious resource, carefully washed and reused. The dressing would be changed periodically, allowing the healer or family member to check for the dreaded signs of infection: angry redness spreading from the wound, a foul smell, the presence of thick yellow pus, and a raging fever. If infection took hold, the options were terrifyingly limited. The wound might be packed with honey, whose natural antibacterial properties were known, or with bread mold, a startling precursor to the discovery of penicillin. In the most dire cases, the only hope was cauterization, searing the wound shut with a red-hot piece of iron,
an excruciatingly painful procedure that aimed to burn away the infected tissue. For broken bones, the treatment was a feat of practical engineering. The bone would have to be set, a painful process of manipulating the limb until the two broken ends were allied. The bone setter, often the local blacksmith, or a person with strong hands and a steady nerve, would pull and twist the limb into place, guided by feel alone. Once set, the limb was immobilized. Splints were fashioned from flat pieces of wood, bound tightly to the limb with linen strips or leather cords. The limb would then be held in a sling or simply kept immobile for weeks until the bone had a chance to knit itself back together. There was no X-ray to check the alignment, no physical therapy to regain function. A poorly set bone could result in a permanent limp or a useless limb. Survival in the face of such injuries required a profound stoicism. Pain was a constant, to be endured without the aid of modern analgesics. The outcome was often left to fate, to God's will, and to the body's own incredible capacity to heal. A person might survive a horrific wound only to succumb to the infection that followed. Or they might make a full recovery from a grievous injury through sheer resilience. To be injured was to be brought to the very edge of existence, to be cared for with the best practical knowledge available, and then to wait, patiently and prayerfully, for the body to choose the path of life or the path of decay.
The river as provider. The river was the lifeblood of the landscape, a silver artery that pulsed with the rhythms of the seasons. It was a constant presence, its gentle, ceaseless movement a backdrop to the cycles of human life. For the communities settled along its banks, the river was not just a feature of the geography. It was a provider, a highway, a laundry, and a constant source of both sustenance and danger. The relationship with the river was one of deep, practical intimacy, a daily dialogue conducted in the language of currents, depths, and clarity. It gave freely, but it also demanded respect, and to forget its power was to risk being swept away by it. First and foremost, the river was a source of water. Every day, women and children would make the trip to the river's edge, their wooden buckets or clay jugs heavy on the return journey. This water was used for everything, for drinking, for cooking the daily pottage, for washing clothes, and for watering the small kitchen gardens. The quality of the water was judged by the senses. Clear, fast-moving water was considered the safest, while stagnant, murky water from a slow-moving backwater was avoided. People understood that a river could be fouled by a settlement upstream, and they knew to draw their drinking water from a point above where the village's own waste entered the flow. It was a simple, intuitive form of sanitation, a recognition of the river's ability to both cleanse and carry contamination. The river was also a living larder, a vital source of protein that supplemented the often meager diet. Fishing was a year-round activity, practiced with a variety of ingenious, low-tech methods. Simple lines with hooks carved from bone or wood were used, baited with worms or insects. More effective were the nets and traps. Large nets could be stretched across a section of the river and drawn in by a team of people, hopefully laden with a wriggling catch. Wicker traps, shaped like a cone or a basket with an inverted entrance, were a more passive method. These would be baited and placed in the current, their clever design allowing fish to swim in but not out. After a day or two, the traps would be hauled up, their contents a welcome addition to the family pot. In the shallow parts of the river, fish could be speared, a test of a quick eye and a steady hand. The catch, trout, perch, pike, and the prized salmon would be cooked fresh over the fire or smoked and salted for the winter. The river's edge was the village laundry. On washing days, women would gather by the water,
kneeling on flat stones and beating their linen undergarments and woolen clothes against the rocks. The current would help to rinse away the dirt, and the abrasive action of the beating would work the grime out of the coarse fibers. This was hard, physical work, their hands raw from the cold water and the rough cloth, but it was also a social occasion, a time for conversation and shared labor. The clean, wet clothes would then be spread out on nearby bushes or grassy banks to dry in the sun and the wind. The river also shaped the landscape and the work. The fertile, silty soil of the floodplains was the richest agricultural land, producing the best crops. But this gift came with a risk. A sudden heavy rain could cause the river to swell, to break its banks and inundate the very fields that it had enriched, washing away a season's work in a single muddy torrent. People learned to read the river's moods, to recognize the signs of a coming flood in its color, its speed, and its sound. They built their homes on slightly higher ground, a small but crucial elevation that could mean the difference between a dry floor and a devastating inundation. The river was a force of both creation and destruction, a duality that was at the heart of the medieval worldview. To live by the river was to be in constant communion with the natural flow of the world. It was to know the whisper of the current, the flash of a silver fish beneath the surface, the weight of a waterlogged bucket, and the deep, enduring power that lay within its gentle-seeming movement. It was a provider of life's essentials, a silent, flowing partner in the daily struggle for survival.
Boil, simmer, burn. The medieval kitchen was not a room of gleaming surfaces and precise temperatures. It was a smoky, fire-lit space dominated by a single, powerful element, the open hearth. All cooking was an extension of this central fire, a slow and patient art form that relied on an intimate understanding of heat in its various forms. There were no timers, no thermometers, no cookbooks with exact instructions. There was only the cook's intuition, honed by years of practice and a deep sensory connection to the food as it transformed over the flames. The rhythm of the kitchen was the rhythm of the fire itself, the intense heat of the initial blaze, the steady glow of the embers, and the gentle, radiant warmth that lingered long after. Cooking was a process of boiling, simmering, and sometimes burning. The most common method of cooking was in a single large cauldron, typically made of iron or bronze, suspended over the fire from a hook and chain. This cauldron was the heart of the culinary world, the vessel in which the daily pottage was born. Pottage was the cornerstone of the medieval diet, a thick, soupy stew that could be adapted to whatever ingredients were on hand. It began with a base of water or a thin broth, to which grains like oats, barley, or rye were added. These would simmer slowly for hours, the cook adjusting the height of the cauldron over the fire to control the temperature. A higher position resulted in a gentle simmer, a lower position, a rolling boil. Into this base would go anything and everything the pantry or garden could offer. Chopped root vegetables like turnips and carrots, hearty greens like cabbage or kale, a handful of dried beans or peas. If the family was lucky, a few scraps of salted meat or a piece of fatty bacon would be added to lend its savory flavor to the entire pot. The pottage was a continuous creation, often never fully emptied, with new ingredients simply added to the old, its flavors deepening and evolving over days. Baking was a more complex affair, requiring a different kind of heat. For those without access to a communal village oven, baking happened directly in the hearth. A flat, heavy stone would be placed in the embers of the fire until it was intensely hot. The flattened dough for a simple griddle cake or a loaf of unleavened bread would be placed directly on this stone, cooking quickly from the intense heat below.
For a more sophisticated bake, a lidded cast iron pot, a precursor to the Dutch oven, could be used. The pot, filled with dough, would be placed directly in the embers, and more hot coals would be piled on top of the lid. This created a miniature oven, surrounding the bread with an even, radiant heat, allowing it to rise and form a thick, dark crust. The cook would know the bread was done not by a timer, but by its hollow sound when tapped, and by its rich, irresistible smell. Roasting was a method reserved for special occasions, a celebration of a rare piece of fresh meat. A spit, a long rod of wood or iron, would be positioned in front of the fire, supported by two uprights. The meat, a chicken, a joint of pork, a rabbit, would be skewered on the spit and turned slowly, by hand or by a simple mechanical device. This required constant attention. The cook had to ensure the meat turned at a steady pace, so it cooked evenly without burning. Dripping fat would be collected in a pan below and used to baste the meat, keeping it moist and creating a savory, crispy skin. The process filled the small home with an almost agonizingly delicious aroma, a promise of a feast to come. The fire was a versatile tool, offering many levels of heat. Vegetables or fish could be wrapped in large damp leaves and placed directly in the cool ashes at the edge of the hearth to steam gently in their own juices. Eggs could be buried in the hot embers to bake slowly in their shells. The cook's hands were her thermometers, feeling the radiant heat from the fire to judge its intensity. Her ears listened to the sound of a simmer versus a boil. Her nose told her when the bread was baked or the meat was roasted. It was a holistic, sensory experience, a dance with the flames. Food was not quickly prepared, it was coaxed, tended, and patiently transformed by the ancient, living power of the fire.
When the larder was empty, there was a form of survival that exists beyond the careful planning of the harvest and the skillful preservation of the pantry. It is the survival of the lean times, the desperate months at the end of winter when the salted meat is gone, the grain sack is empty, and the promise of spring is still a distant, frozen hope. This was the season of famine, a recurring and terrifying feature of medieval life. When the larder was empty, a different kind of knowledge was called upon. A grim, creative, and often bitter cuisine of last resort. This was the food of pure endurance, a diet designed not for pleasure or even nourishment, but for the sole purpose of silencing the gnawing ache of an empty stomach and staying alive for one more day. When the grain ran out, the first substitute was the stuff of the forest floor. Acorns, normally left for the pigs, became human food. The process of making them edible was long and laborious. They had to be shelled, crushed, and then leached for days in running water or boiled in multiple changes of water to remove the bitter, toxic tannins. The resulting pulp could be mixed with whatever scraps of flour remained, or used on its own, to be baked into a dark, heavy, and often disagreeably bitter bread. It was a food that filled the belly, but offered little joy. When even acorns were scarce, people turned to the trees themselves. The soft, inner bark of certain trees, like pine or birch, could be scraped away, dried, and ground into a coarse powder. This bark bread was little more than indigestible fiber, a way to trick the stomach into feeling full, but it contained almost no nutritional value. It was the food of absolute desperation. The wild plants that were ignored during times of plenty became staples. The forager's eye, once searching for the choicest greens, now looked for anything that was not overtly poisonous. Tough, bitter roots that were normally disdained were dug from the frozen ground and boiled for hours to make them palatable. Stinging nettles, dandelions, and all manner of common weeds were gathered and thrown into the pottage pot, which now contained little more than water and these foraged greens.
The resulting soup would be thin and bitter, but it was hot, and it was something. Mosses and lichens scraped from rocks and trees might be boiled in the hope of extracting some small measure of sustenance. The boundary between what was considered food for humans and food for animals dissolved completely. Peas and beans that were normally grown as fodder for livestock were consumed. The husks and chaff from the threshing floor, the dusty waste product of the grain harvest, would be collected and boiled into a thin, gritty gruel. If a family was fortunate enough to still have a living animal, they would not dare to slaughter it, as it represented the hope of future breeding. Instead, they might draw a small amount of blood from the animal, a practice known as bleeding, and mix it with a little oatmeal or flour to be fried into a blood pudding. This was a way to harvest protein from the animal without killing it. Hunger changed the senses. The smell of boiling leather, as people tried to soften old shoes or scraps of hide into something chewable, would hang in the air. The sound of the village would change, the normal hustle and bustle replaced by a slow, weary quiet. The greatest fear was not just the hunger itself, but the weakness it brought, leaving the body vulnerable to the smallest sickness. A simple cold could become a fatal illness in a body starved of nutrients. Surviving a famine was a testament to the absolute stubbornness of the human will to live. It was a period of grim creativity, of pushing the boundaries of what was considered edible. It was an experience that would be seared into the memory of those who endured it, shaping their relationship with food for the rest of their lives. The joy of the first spring greens, the deep satisfaction of a full harvest, these feelings were made all the more profound by the memory of the long, silent winter when the larder was empty and survival was measured in mouthfuls of boiled weeds and bitter bark.
Barter and brotherhood. In the modern imagination, the medieval world is often seen through the lens of kings and currency, of gold coins and silver shillings. But for the vast majority of people living in small, rural villages, life was not governed by the jingle of coin in a purse. Coin was scarce, a thing seen only on rare occasions like market day or when the Lord's tax collector came to call. The true economy, the system that kept the village alive and functioning, was a complex, unwritten web of barter, obligation, and mutual support. Survival was a team sport, and the currency was not gold, but eggs, labor, a measure of grain, or a promise kept. This was the economy of brotherhood, a system built on trust, reputation, and the shared understanding that everyone's fortune was tied together. The simplest form of this economy was direct barter. A family with a surplus of eggs from their chickens might trade a dozen of them to a neighbor in exchange for a portion of the cheese that neighbor had recently made. The woman who was skilled at spinning strong, even yarn might trade her work for a basket of root vegetables from the woman whose garden had been particularly productive. The blacksmith, whose work with iron was essential to the entire community, would not always be paid in coin. More often, he would be paid in food, in firewood, in ale from the local brewer, or in promises of labor from the farmers whose plows he had mended. There were no price tags, no fixed exchange rates. A fair trade was determined by need, by relationship, and by a shared sense of value. A handful of salt in the dead of winter might be worth far more than it was in the autumn, and a strong back during the harvest was a commodity beyond price. Beyond simple one-to-one trades, there was a deeper system of reciprocal obligation. This was the understanding that a favor given today would be returned in the future when the need arose. If a man's roof was damaged in a storm, his neighbors would not present him with a bill for their help in repairing it. They would simply come and help, knowing that if their own roof was ever damaged, he would do the same for them. When a woman fell ill after childbirth,
The other women of the village would take turns tending her fire, cooking for her family, and watching her older children. This was not charity in the modern sense. It was a form of communal insurance, a safety net woven from countless threads of mutual support. This system extended to the sharing of resources and tools. A village might only have one heavy plow, owned by the lord or a wealthier peasant. The use of this plow would be shared among the villagers, with each family providing the labor of their own ox or their own shoulders to pull it. The mill for grinding grain and the oven for baking bread were often communal, their use paid for with a small portion of the flour or a loaf from the batch. These shared assets reinforced the idea that the village was a single, interdependent organism. The success of one family's crop contributed to the well-being of all, because it meant more grain for the mill, more bread for the oven, and more potential for trade within the community. Reputation was the ultimate currency in this system. A person's word was their bond. A family known to be hardworking, honest, and generous in times of plenty would find that generosity returned to them in times of need. A person known to be lazy, dishonest, or stingy would find themselves isolated, their requests for help met with hesitation or refusal. In a small, close-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business, social standing was a powerful motivator for cooperation. To be ostracized from the village's web of reciprocity was a form of economic death. This economy of barter and brotherhood was not a utopian ideal. It was born of harsh necessity. In a world with no social safety nets, no government assistance, and no easy way to store wealth, mutual dependence was the only rational strategy for survival. It fostered a deep sense of place and belonging, a powerful we that stood against the constant threats of hunger, sickness, and disaster. The village was not just a collection of individual households, it was a single, larger household, its economy run on a currency of trust, and its profits measured in the simple, profound metric of collective survival.
Sleep without silence. Sleep in the 21st century is a private, curated experience. We seek silence, shutting our doors, drawing our blackout curtains, and sometimes even employing machines to produce a steady, featureless white noise. We see sleep as a solitary journey into unconsciousness. For the medieval person, sleep was rarely private and almost never silent. It was a communal, porous state, entered into amidst a rich and varied soundscape, a world away from the quiet solitude we now crave. To go to sleep was not to escape the world, but to experience it in a different, more subdued register. The setting for sleep was the single-room dwelling, a space that served as kitchen, living room, and bedroom for the entire family. There were no separate bedrooms to retreat to. The bed itself was often the largest piece of furniture in the home, a low wooden frame filled with a deep mattress of straw or chaff, which rustled and crackled with every movement. This bed was a communal space shared by parents, children, and sometimes even an elderly grandparent or a visiting relative. People slept huddled together, not just for warmth, but because it was the natural way of things. The night was a time of shared vulnerability, and there was a sense of security in the close physical presence of family. The silence we associate with nighttime was an illusion. The medieval night was filled with its own symphony of sounds, a tapestry of the domestic and the wild. From within the hut came the soft, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping family, punctuated by the occasional cough, sigh, or a child's sleepy murmur. If animals were sheltered in an attached byre, or even within the same room, their sounds would be part of the nocturnal chorus. The low, contented munching of a cow chewing its cud,
the soft grunt of a pig, the gentle rustle of chickens on their roost. The house itself was a source of sound. The timber frame would creak and groan as it settled in the cool night air. The wind would find its way through the cracks in the wattle and daub walls, creating a low, mournful whistle. Rain would drum a soft, hypnotic rhythm on the thatched roof. From outside, the sounds of the natural world pressed in. The deep, resonant hoot of an owl, the distant bark of a fox, the frantic chirping of crickets on a summer night. These were not disturbances, but the familiar sounds of the world at rest. In the village, a neighbor's dog might bark at a passing shadow, or the church bell might toll to mark the passing of the hours of the night watch. These sounds were markers of time and place, orienting the sleeper within their world even in the darkness. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval sleep, and one that modern science is beginning to re-examine, is that it may not have been a single, unbroken stretch of 8 hours. Historical records suggest that many people practiced what is now called segmented sleep. They would go to bed shortly after dusk and sleep for a period of 3 to 4 hours, a first sleep. They would then wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night. This period of quiet wakefulness, known as the watch, was not seen as a form of insomnia, but as a useful and natural part of the night. It was a time for quiet contemplation, for prayer, for intimate conversation with a spouse, or for tending to the banked fire. It was a calm, liminal state, a peaceful interlude between two periods of sleep. After this waking period, they would return to bed for a second sleep, which would last until dawn. This pattern of sleep was perfectly adapted to a world without artificial light. The long, dark hours of a winter night were not something to be conquered or slept through in a single block, but a period to be inhabited. Sleep was not an escape from life, but an extension of it. It was a social, sensory, and flexible state woven into the very fabric of the home and the natural world. To fall asleep was to sink into the shared warmth of the family bed, to the rhythm of familiar sounds, and to trust that the world would continue its quiet living pulse around you until the first light of dawn.
Beasts beside us. In the modern world, our relationship with animals is often one of distance or sentiment. They are either industrial commodities, far removed from our daily lives, or cherished pets, treated as members of the family. In the medieval village, the relationship was something else entirely, a deep, pragmatic, and unsentimental partnership. Animals were not pets. They were co-workers, four-legged tools, and living, breathing assets. They were woven into the very fabric of daily survival, their lives and the lives of the humans they served inextricably linked. They were the beasts beside us, their presence a constant, vital part of the domestic landscape. The most important of these partners was the ox. The ox was the engine of medieval agriculture, the living tractor that made the cultivation of the heavy, dense soils of Europe possible. Strong, patient, and possessing incredible stamina, a pair of oxen could pull a heavy wooden plow through the earth from sunup to sundown. Their broad backs, their slow, steady gait, their gentle, placid nature, these were the rhythms that set the pace of the planting season. The peasant's relationship with his ox was one of profound dependence. The health of the animal was paramount. It would be fed and watered before the family ate. Its hooves would be checked for stones, its hide for sores. To lose an ox to sickness or injury was a catastrophe, a blow from which a poor family might never recover. The ox was more than an animal. It was the key to the harvest, the promise of bread. If the ox was the engine, the cow was the source of liquid sustenance. A single milk cow was a treasure,
a provider of daily nourishment in a world where food was often scarce. The morning and evening milking was a fundamental ritual of the household. The fresh, warm milk was a food for children, a base for simple porridges, and the starting point for the alchemy of the dairy. With skill and patience, the perishable milk could be transformed into longer-lasting products. The tangy, clotted cream, the rich, yellow butter, and most importantly, the hard, durable cheese that could be stored for months, providing a vital source of fat and protein through the winter. The cow, with her gentle lowing and sweet breath, was a walking, breathing larder, a symbol of domestic wealth and stability. Smaller livestock were the backbone of the household economy. Pigs were the ultimate recyclers, intelligent and hardy animals that could thrive on household scraps, foraged roots, and forest mast. They were the savings account of the peasant family, a way to convert waste into valuable meat. The slaughter of the autumn pig was a major event, providing the hams and bacon that would be salted and smoked to last the year. Goats, hardier than sheep and able to survive on rougher forage, were another source of milk, cheese, and meat. And chickens, scratching in the dirt around the doorway, were a source of constant, low-level protein. Their eggs were a daily miracle, a perfect package of nutrition that could be eaten immediately or used as a valuable item for barter. The dog and the cat have their own practical roles. The dog was not a pampered companion, but a working animal. It was a guardian, its sharp bark a warning against intruders, both human and animal. It was a herder, helping to manage the sheep or a flock of geese. It was a hunter, helping to catch rabbits and other small game. The cat, too, earned its keep. Its job was to patrol the home and the grain store, a silent, efficient hunter of the mice and rats that could decimate a family's food supply. A good mouser was a highly valued member of the household. Its presence was a form of biological pest control. These animals often lived in close proximity to the family, sometimes even under the same roof. This was not just for their safety, but for the shared warmth their bodies provided in the cold winter months. The sounds and smells of these beasts were part of the fabric of home. Their lives were shorter and often harder than those of their human counterparts, but they were treated with a practical respect born of absolute necessity. They were not friends in the modern sense, but they were essential allies, partners in the great, ongoing project of survival. They were the beasts who labored, provided, and guarded. Their quiet, steady presence, a constant, living reminder of the deep and unbreakable bond between humanity and the animal world. Facing the plague wind. There are threats that can be seen and fought, the raider on the horizon, the wolf at the edge of the woods. But there is another kind of threat, one that is invisible, silent, and moves on the air itself. In the Middle Ages, this threat had a name, the pestilence, the great mortality, the plague. When it arrived, it was like a foul wind blowing through the world, a force of nature against which there was no solid defense. Surviving the plague was not a matter of skill or strength in the traditional sense. It was a terrifying game of chance, a desperate retreat into isolation, and a profound test of faith in a world that suddenly seemed abandoned by God. The arrival of the plague in a village was often quiet at first, a rumor from a traveler, a story of a nearby town where the church bells were tolling constantly. Then the first sickness. A person would develop a sudden high fever, their body racked with chills and aches. Then came the telltale sign, the grotesque harbinger of the disease, the bubo. A hard, painful swelling, often the size of an egg or an apple, would appear in the groin, the armpit, or on the neck. This was followed by the darkening of the skin, the Black Death, that gave the plague its most famous name. From the appearance of the first symptoms, the path to death was often swift and agonizing, lasting only a few days. As the sickness spread from one household to the next, the normal rhythms of village life would collapse. Fear, a cold and heavy blanket, would descend upon the community. People would begin to shun their neighbors. A friendly greeting would be replaced by a suspicious glance. The communal bonds that were the bedrock of daily survival would fracture under the immense pressure of this invisible enemy. The primary survival technique, and the only one that seemed to offer any hope, was isolation. A family might bar its door from the inside, refusing to see anyone, hoping to wait out the storm. Entire villages would try to quarantine themselves, posting guards on the roads to turn away any outsiders who might be carrying the sickness. In the absence of a scientific understanding of the disease, people turned to the theories of the time. It was believed that the plague was carried on miasma, or bad air, a foul-smelling vapor that rose from swamps, rotting matter, or was sent as a punishment from God. The fight against the plague became a fight against this bad air. People would burn aromatic substances in their homes and in the streets, juniper, rosemary, laurel, and incense, in the hope that the pleasant, purifying smoke would drive away the poisonous miasma. They would carry pomanders, small metal orbs filled with fragrant spices, holding them to their noses when they had to venture outside. The iconic image of the plague doctor, with his long bird-like mask, was based on this theory. The beak of the mask was stuffed with herbs and spices, a personal air filter against the toxic world. As the death toll mounted, the rituals of life and death broke down. There were too many dead to be given proper burials. The sound of the single church bell tolling for each soul was replaced by the grim, constant work of the death carts, which would patrol the streets with the call to "Bring out your dead." Mass graves were dug, bodies piled in with little ceremony, a desperate measure to deal with the overwhelming scale of the loss. The grief was immense, but it was a quiet, stunned grief, a community hollowed out by a force it could not comprehend. Surviving the plague was often a matter of pure, inexplicable luck. Some people seemed to have a natural immunity. Some families, practicing strict isolation, managed to avoid the sickness entirely. Others, despite their best efforts, would be wiped out completely. For those who did survive, the world they emerged into was forever changed. The landscape was emptier, the silence in the village profound. There was a deep psychological scar, a sense of having lived through the end of the world. But there was also a strange new reality. With so many dead, labor was suddenly scarce, and therefore more valuable. The rigid social structures of the old world had been shaken to their core. To survive the plague wind was to be left standing in a new and unfamiliar world, haunted by the ghosts of the old one, and forever marked by the memory of the invisible war.
The forest as mother. Beyond the plowed fields and the familiar paths of the village lay the forest. To the modern mind, the forest is a place of recreation, a park for hiking and enjoying nature. To the medieval peasant, the forest was a vastly more complex and powerful entity. It was a place of deep ambiguity, at once a source of immense bounty and a realm of profound danger. It was feared for its darkness, its predators, and its disorienting depths. But it was also revered and relied upon as a kind of wild, untamed mother, a provider of the essential materials for life and survival that could not be found anywhere else. To enter the forest was to step into a different kingdom, one with its own ancient rules and its own generous, if sometimes frightening, gifts. The most fundamental gift of the forest was wood. Wood was the universal building block of medieval life. the timbers for a peasant's hut, the strong oak posts that formed its frame, the pliable hazel or willow branches that were woven into the wattle for the walls, all came from the forest. It was the source of fuel for the hearth, the fire that cooked the food and kept the deadly winter cold at bay. The daily gathering of firewood was a constant chore, a search for fallen branches and dead wood that could be carried back to the village. Wood was also the material for nearly every tool and object of daily life: the handle of the axe, the shaft of the spear, the body of the cart, the bowl for the pottage, the spoon to eat it with. A person's life was surrounded from cradle to coffin by the products of the forest. The forest was also an extension of the larder, a vast and varied pantry for those who knew its secrets. In the autumn, the forest floor would be thick with nuts, walnuts, hazelnuts, and chestnuts that could be gathered and stored for the winter. For the pigs, the forest was a paradise of acorns and beechnuts, and a peasant with the right to graze his pigs in the Lord's woods could fatten them for slaughter at little cost. The forest was home to wild game, a source of fresh meat that was a rare luxury for most. While the right to hunt large game, like deer, was often reserved for the nobility, a peasant might be able to snare a rabbit or a wild bird, a welcome addition to the pot. And beneath the canopy, in the dappled light and the damp soil, grew the wild abundance of the forager: mushrooms, wild garlic, and a host of edible leaves and roots. The forest was the village pharmacy. The healer knew where to find the willow for easing pain, the yarrow for dressing wounds, the comfrey root for mending broken bones. The barks, leaves, and roots of the forest trees and plants held a vast, unwritten knowledge of medicine, a power to soothe, to heal, and to cure. The forest also provided the raw materials for other essential goods. Wild beehives in hollow trees were a precious source of honey, the primary sweetener of the age, and beeswax, which could be used to make candles, a luxury that brought a clean, bright light to the smoky darkness of the hut. But the forest was not a gentle, benevolent provider. It had a darker side. It was the home of predators, wolves and wild boar, that were a real and present danger to both livestock and humans. To be lost in the forest was a terrifying prospect. Its dense, pathless interior could easily disorient a traveler, and to be caught in the woods after dark was to be at the mercy of its nocturnal dangers and its palpable, ancient sense of mystery. The forest was also the realm of folklore, a place of spirits, fairies, and outlaws. It represented the untamed, the chaotic, the world beyond the ordered human control of the village and the field. To survive, a peasant had to learn to navigate this dual nature of the forest. They had to learn its paths, its resources, and its rhythms. They had to know which parts were safe and which were dangerous, which plants were nourishing and which were poisonous. The forest demanded respect. It was a mother who provided for her children, but she was a wild and unpredictable mother, one who could be as quick to punish as she was to reward. Her gifts were essential for life, and the relationship with her was one of constant, cautious, and grateful dependence.
Faith to endure the storm. In a world governed by forces far beyond human control, the sudden storm, the failed harvest, the inexplicable sickness, survival was not just a physical struggle. It was a profound spiritual and psychological challenge. The constant uncertainty, the proximity to death, and the sheer hardship of daily life could easily lead to despair. In this context, faith was not a quiet, private matter or a philosophical abstraction. It was a powerful, practical, and essential tool of survival. It was the bedrock on which resilience was built, the invisible fuel that powered the human spirit through the longest, darkest nights. The candle in the church, the familiar words of a prayer, the rhythm of the liturgical year, these were the anchors that held the soul steady in the midst of the storm. Faith provided a framework of meaning for a life that often seemed random and cruel. The teachings of the church offered an explanation for suffering. It was a test of faith, a consequence of original sin, or a path to purification. This did not make the suffering any less painful, but it gave it a purpose. A peasant who lost a child to fever or a crop to hail could find a strange and powerful comfort in the belief that this tragedy was part of a divine plan, however inscrutable. This worldview fostered a sense of acceptance and stoicism, a capacity to endure hardship without falling into the abyss of nihilism. Life on earth was a temporary pilgrimage, a brief and difficult journey toward the eternal reward of heaven. This promise of a better world to come made the struggles of the present one bearable. The rituals of the church provided a steady, comforting rhythm to the year, a spiritual calendar that ran parallel to the agricultural one. The bleak penitential season of Lent, with its fasting and introspection, gave way to the explosive joy of Easter, a celebration of rebirth that coincided with the awakening of the land in spring. The feast days of the saints broke up the monotony of labor, providing holidays, celebrations, and a connection to the great stories of the faith. These shared rituals brought the community together, reinforcing their collective identity and their shared belief system. The village church was the physical and spiritual center of the community, its stone walls a symbol of permanence and sanctuary in a fragile world. Prayer was a direct and personal tool for survival. It was a way to speak into the vast silence of the universe and feel that you were being heard. People prayed for everything, for a safe childbirth, for the recovery of a sick cow, for rain for the thirsty crops, for protection from the plague. A prayer was a small act of hope, a casting of one's anxieties into the hands of a higher power. The repetition of the Pater Noster or the Ave Maria could be a form of meditation, a way to calm a troubled mind and focus the spirit. The lighting of a small candle before the statue of a saint was a physical manifestation of a plea, a small flame of hope against the darkness. Faith also provided a moral compass that reinforced the communal bonds necessary for survival. The Christian teachings of charity, compassion, and responsibility for one's neighbor were not just abstract virtues. They were a blueprint for a functional, interdependent society. The injunction to love thy neighbor as thyself was a spiritual reinforcement of the pragmatic need for mutual support. This shared moral code helped to regulate behavior, to discourage selfishness, and to foster the kind of trust that was essential for the economy of barter and brotherhood to function. This faith was not always serene or scholarly. It was a visceral, earthy faith, deeply intertwined with folk beliefs, local traditions, and a healthy dose of superstition. People wore amulets for protection, believed in the power of holy relics to heal, and saw the hand of God or the devil in the everyday events of their lives. But this did not diminish its power. It made it more immediate, more accessible. It was a faith that was lived, breathed, and felt in the bones. In a life of constant physical labor and material poverty, faith was the great internal resource, a wellspring of strength that could not be exhausted. It was the conviction that even in the deepest darkness there was a guiding light, and that endurance in itself was a sacred act.
Stormproofing the home. The modern home is a fortress of comfort, its walls packed with high-tech insulation, its windows double glazed, its foundation sealed against the damp. It is designed to hold the outside world at a comfortable distance. The medieval home, by contrast, was in a constant, intimate dialogue with the elements. It was a simple, porous shelter, built not to conquer nature, but to negotiate with it. Stormproofing this humble dwelling was not a one-time construction project, but an ongoing process of maintenance, adaptation, and clever design using the materials the local landscape provided. The goal was not to create a perfect seal, but to build a shelter that could bend without breaking, a home that was resilient enough to survive the wind, the rain, and the snow. The foundation of the home was the earth itself. In many cases, there was no foundation in the modern sense. The main timber posts that formed the skeleton of the house might be set directly into the ground. A more advanced technique, known as a cruck frame, involved using large, curved timbers that rose from near the ground to meet at the roof's peak, creating a strong A-frame structure that was inherently stable against the wind. To combat the pervasive dampness of the ground, a shallow trench might be dug around the perimeter of the home to help drain away rainwater, a simple but effective form of drainage that helped to keep the earthen floor from turning to mud. The walls were a masterful construction of simple materials, a technique known as wattle and daub. First, a lattice of pliable wooden stakes and woven branches, the wattle, usually hazel or willow, was created between the main timber posts. This created a flexible but sturdy framework. Then, the daub was applied. This was a sticky, thick plaster made from a mixture of wet clay, soil, sand, chopped straw, and animal dung. This mixture was packed onto and into the wattle lattice by hand, pushed into every crevice until the wall was a solid, thick mass. The straw and dung acted as binders, preventing the clay from cracking as it dried. A well-made wattle and daub wall was surprisingly effective. It was a poor insulator by modern standards, but it was breathable, allowing moisture to escape, and its sheer thickness provided a decent barrier against the wind. The roof was the home's primary shield against the rain, and its construction was a specialized art. The most common roofing material for a peasant's dwelling was thatch. Long, tough stalks of wheat, rye, or reeds were harvested, dried, and then bundled together. These bundles were then layered onto the timber roof frame, starting from the bottom and working up, with each layer overlapping the one below it. The thatch was tied down securely with tarred rope or twisted withies. A thick, well-maintained thatched roof, often several feet deep, was remarkably waterproof. The steep pitch of the roof ensured that water ran off quickly, and the dense layers of straw prevented it from penetrating to the interior. Thatch also provided excellent insulation, keeping the home warmer in winter and cooler in summer. The main drawback was its vulnerability to fire and its need for regular maintenance, with new layers being added every few years to patch leaks and replace decayed material. Openings were the weak points in the home's defenses. Doors were made of thick, solid planks of wood and would be fitted with a simple latch or a heavy wooden bar on the inside to secure it against both intruders and strong winds. A heavy curtain of hide or thick wool would often be hung over the inside of the doorway to provide an extra layer of insulation and to block drafts. Windows were a liability. In the simplest huts, there were no windows at all. Where they did exist, they were small, unglazed openings. At night or during a storm, these openings would be covered with wooden shutters or stuffed with bundles of straw or oiled cloth to keep out the wind and rain. Surviving a storm in such a home would have been a loud, sensory experience. The wind would howl and whistle through the cracks, the rain would drum a deafening tattoo on the thatched roof, and the whole structure would creak and groan under the strain. But these homes were designed for resilience. Their flexible timber frames could give slightly in the wind without snapping, and their heavy, low-slung profiles kept them anchored to the earth. Stormproofing was not about creating a silent, immovable object. It was about building a living, breathing shelter that was in partnership with its environment, a home that was strong enough to endure.
Raising the survivors. In a world where nearly half of all children did not survive to adulthood, The act of raising a child was a constant, anxious vigil. Childhood as we understand it, a protected, extended period of play and education, was a luxury few could afford. From the moment of birth, a child was initiated into the harsh realities of medieval life. They were not coddled or shielded from the world, but gradually and purposefully integrated into its demanding rhythms. Raising a child was not about fostering their individual potential. It was about raising a survivor, a future contributor to the household's economy, a resilient human being capable of enduring the hardships that lay ahead. The first year of life was the most perilous. The infant was kept close, a practice born of both affection and necessity. Swaddling was a near universal practice. The baby would be wrapped tightly from neck to toe in long strips of linen cloth. This was believed to serve multiple purposes. It kept the infant warm, it was thought to help their limbs grow straight, and it effectively immobilized them, making them easier to manage while the mother went about her endless chores. The swaddled infant could be laid in a simple wooden cradle near the hearth, or carried on the mother's back as she worked in the fields or garden. Breastfeeding was the norm, and often continued for 2 years or more, providing not only essential nutrition, but also a measure of immunity in a world without vaccinations. As soon as a child could walk, their education began. This was not a formal education of letters and numbers, but a practical apprenticeship in the skills of survival. Learning was done through watching and doing. A small girl would be given a miniature spindle and a tuft of wool, imitating her mother's spinning. A young boy would follow his father to the fields, learning the names of the tools and the rhythm of the work. Chores were assigned from a very early age. A 5-year-old might be tasked with gathering firewood, scattering grain for the chickens, or watching a younger sibling. These were not just chores to keep them busy, they were essential contributions to the family's well-being. Work and play were often intertwined. A game of chasing geese was also the task of keeping them from wandering away. Children were exposed to the full spectrum of life and death. They would witness the birth of a calf, the slaughter of a pig, the slow decline of an elderly grandparent. Death was not a sanitized, hidden event. It happened in the home, in the shared space of the single-room dwelling. This constant exposure to the raw, unsentimental cycles of nature and life bred a kind of stoicism and resilience that is hard for the modern mind to comprehend. Children learned early on that life was fragile, that loss was inevitable, and that work was the non-negotiable price of existence. Discipline was often strict and physical, a reflection of a worldview that saw the child's will as something to be broken and reshaped for their own good. But this was balanced by the deep bonds of kinship and community. A child was raised not just by their parents, but by the entire village. They were surrounded by a web of grandparents, aunts, uncles, and neighbors who all played a role in their upbringing, offering a word of correction here, a shared piece of bread there. This communal environment provided a sense of security and belonging that was a powerful counterbalance to the harshness of their daily lives. The goal of this upbringing was to produce a competent, hard-working, and obedient adult. By their teenage years, a young person was expected to have mastered the basic skills necessary to run a household or work the land. A girl would know how to spin, weave, cook, preserve food, and tend a garden. A boy would know how to plow, sow, harvest, manage livestock, and mend a tool. They were not raised to follow their dreams, but to fulfill their duties. It was a hard and often unforgiving path, but it was one that forged individuals of incredible strength and endurance. Young people who were not just prepared for the world they were about to inherit, but who had been an integral part of it since their earliest days. They were, in the truest sense of the word, survivors. guarding without gadgets. In an age of smart locks, motion sensors, and high-definition security cameras, the concept of home security is synonymous with technology. We rely on a complex, invisible network of electronics to feel safe. In the medieval world, security was a far more tangible, human, and sensory affair. There were no gadgets, no alarms, no police force to call. Protection for one's home and family relied on a combination of simple physical barriers, the keen senses of animal partners, and the most powerful security system of all, the watchful eyes and ears of a close-knit community. Guarding the home was a quiet, constant state of vigilance, a low-level alertness woven into the fabric of daily life. The first layer of defense was the door. In a peasant's hut, this was a simple but sturdy construction of thick wooden planks, often cross-braced for added strength. It was not secured by a complex lock and key, which were expensive and rare. Instead, it was fastened from the inside with a heavy wooden drawbar, a thick beam that slid into sturdy brackets on either side of the door frame. Once barred, the door was a formidable obstacle. Windows, being small and few, were less of a concern, but their wooden shutters could also be barred from the inside, plunging the home into a secure, albeit stuffy, darkness. These physical barriers were not impenetrable, but they were a significant deterrent, designed to make a forced entry a noisy, time-consuming, and difficult process. The second, and perhaps most effective layer of security was biological. The family dog was the medieval equivalent of a motion detector and an alarm system rolled into one. It was not a pampered pet, but a working member of the household, chosen for its alertness and territorial nature. A dog's keen hearing could pick up the sound of footsteps on the path long before a human ear could. Its powerful sense of smell could distinguish a familiar neighbor from a stranger. A low growl or a sudden volley of sharp barks was the surest and most immediate signal of a potential threat. At night, the dog would sleep near the door, a living, breathing guardian whose loyalty was absolute and whose vigilance never faltered. Even a flock of geese, with their surprisingly aggressive nature and loud honking cries, can serve as an effective alarm system for a rural homestead. Beyond the individual household, security was a communal responsibility. In a village where everyone knew each other, a stranger was an immediate object of curiosity and suspicion. Their presence would be noted, their business questioned. This informal system of surveillance was incredibly effective. There was no anonymity. An outsider with ill intent could not simply blend in. The collective eyes of the village were always watching. At night, some towns and larger villages would have a formal night watch, a group of men who would patrol the streets with a lantern and a staff, calling out the hours and ensuring that all was well. But even in the smallest hamlet, there was an unspoken agreement to look out for one another. A strange noise at a neighbor's hut, the unfamiliar barking of their dog, would be enough to rouse others from their sleep. This system relied on a deep-seated instinct for territoriality and a clear understanding of the local soundscape. People were attuned to the normal sounds of their environment. They knew the creak of their own gate, the sound of their neighbor's footsteps, the specific bark of their own dog. Any sound that was out of place, a twig snapping in the woods at an unusual hour, a hushed voice where there should be silence, would immediately trigger a state of alert. This was a literacy of sound, a constant subconscious monitoring of the auditory environment for any sign of danger. Security, therefore, was not a passive system that one installed and forgot about. It was an active, participatory process. It was the physical act of barring the door, the trust placed in the senses of a loyal dog, and the shared vigilance of a community. It was a system built on the simple, powerful principles of mutual observation and collective responsibility. It was a reminder that the safest place to be was not necessarily the strongest fortress, but the center of a community where everyone was watching out for everyone else.
Memory as lifeline. In a world where literacy was the privilege of a tiny elite, knowledge was not stored on paper or screens. It was a living, breathing thing, a precious cargo carried in the minds of the people. The most critical survival information, how to farm, how to forage, how to heal, how to build, was not written down in manuals. It was passed from one generation to the next through the ancient and powerful channels of the oral tradition. Memory was not just a faculty, it was a lifeline, a vast, unwritten encyclopedia of lived experience. The survival of the community depended on its ability to remember, to tell, and to listen. The firelight of the hearth was the library, and the human voice was the book. This transfer of knowledge began in childhood through observation and imitation, but it was reinforced and codified through storytelling. The stories told by the elders around the winter fire were not just for entertainment. Woven into the tales of heroes, saints, and fantastical creatures were practical lessons for survival. A story about a foolish boy who got lost in the woods might contain a detailed, memorable description of how to use the sun or the moss on the trees to find one's way. A myth about a forest spirit might include a vital warning about a particular poisonous mushroom that grew in the same area. These narratives made the information sticky, easy to remember, and emotionally resonant. A dry list of facts is easily forgotten. A good story is carried in the heart. Proverbs, rhymes, and songs were another powerful mnemonic device. These short, catchy phrases condensed a wealth of agricultural and ecological wisdom into a form that was easy to recall and recite. A simple rhyme like, "Red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Red sky in the morning, shepherd's warning." These were a reliable and easily remembered tool for weather forecasting. Farming wisdom was encapsulated in sayings that guided the timing of planting and harvesting. Plant your beans when the oak leaf is the size of a mouse's ear. These were not just quaint folk sayings. They were a highly effective, time-tested system for transmitting critical information across generations without the need for writing. The rhythm and melody of a song could carry complex information about which herbs to use for which ailments, or the proper sequence of tasks for a particular craft. The knowledge of the craftsperson, the blacksmith, the weaver, the carpenter, was also an oral tradition. A master would take on an apprentice, and the learning would happen through years of side-by-side work. The master would speak his knowledge, demonstrating a technique while explaining the feel, the sound, and the look of the material when it was being worked correctly. Listen for the change in the sound of the hammer on the iron. That tells you the metal is ready. Feel the tension in the thread, the weaver would advise. It should be tight, but not so tight that it will break. This was a sensory, embodied knowledge transmitted through spoken words and guided hands, a deep understanding that could never be fully captured on the written page. The collective memory of the village was its most valuable asset. The elders were the keepers of this memory, the living archives. They remembered the last great famine and what desperate measures were taken to survive it. They remembered the year of the Great Flood and which parts of the village were safest. They remembered the old paths through the forest, the location of the hidden spring that never ran dry, the stories of their ancestors. Their role was not just to remember, but to interpret and to teach, to ensure that the hard-won lessons of the past were not forgotten by the present. In this world, listening was not a passive activity. It was an active skill, essential for survival. To listen to the stories of the elders, to the proverbs of the farmers, to the instructions of the master craftsperson, this was how one learned to navigate the world. Memory was the thread that connected the generations, a lifeline of knowledge that ensured the continuity of life itself. It was a powerful reminder that the most sophisticated information storage and retrieval system is, and has always been, the human mind animated by the human voice.
Lessons from the long night. As our journey through this quiet, forgotten history comes to a close, we find ourselves back in the present, a world of almost unimaginable comfort and convenience. The long night of the medieval past seems distant, a shadowy landscape of hardship and struggle. We have our checklists, our waterproof gear, our GPS devices, and our shelves stocked with scientifically formulated survival foods. We have, it seems, solved the problem of survival. And yet, there is a quiet whisper from that past, a series of lessons that are not about specific techniques, but about a way of being in the world, a mindset that modern prepping, with all its gadgets and gear, often ignores. The first lesson is one of profound humility. Medieval survival was predicated on the understanding that humanity was not in control. Nature, the weather, the seasons, the fertility of the soil was the dominant force. The goal was not to conquer the environment, but to live in partnership with it, to listen to its subtle cues, and to bend to its will. This fostered a deep and abiding respect for the natural world, a sense of being a small part of a much larger system. Modern survival often takes the opposite approach, seeking to dominate and insulate, to impose our will on the environment with technology. The past reminds us that true resilience may lie not in control, but in adaptation and respect. The second lesson is about the power of sensory knowledge. We live in a world of mediated experience, our senses dulled by the constant hum of technology. We look at a weather app instead of the clouds. We follow a recipe instead of feeling the dough. The medieval survivor possessed a literacy of the senses that we have almost entirely lost. They could read the story of the coming rain in the ache of their joints, smell the health of the soil, feel the rightness of a tool in their hand. This deep, embodied knowledge, this intimate connection to the physical world is a form of wealth and a tool of survival that no gadget can replicate. It invites us to slow down, to pay attention, to reawaken the dormant wisdom of our own senses. The third, and perhaps most important lesson, is the profound truth of our interdependence. The modern prepper ideal is often one of rugged individualism, the lone survivor in their fortified bunker. Medieval survival teaches the opposite lesson. The individual is fragile, but the community is strong. The safety net was not a government program, but the bonds of kinship and neighborhood. The economy was not built on coin, but on the currency of trust, barter, and mutual obligation. To survive was to be part of a we, not a fortified I. This ancient wisdom challenges our modern assumptions, reminding us that our greatest strength, our ultimate survival tool, may not be what we have stored in our basement, but who we can count on next door. As we drift now, on the edge of sleep, we can let these quiet lessons settle. We can honor the forgotten skills of our ancestors, not with a sense of romantic nostalgia for a brutal past, but with a quiet appreciation for their incredible resilience. we can appreciate the steady warmth of the banked embers, the deep wisdom of the forager's eye, the communal strength of a village facing the storm. The long night of the past has ended, but its echoes remain. They invite us to reconnect in our own small ways with the earth beneath our feet, with the knowledge in our hands, and with the simple, enduring power of facing the world together. They remind us that survival is not just an event we prepare for, but a quiet, steady, and graceful way of life.